Get ready to dive into a world where colossal fortunes, noble titles, and a distinct lack of spouses led to some of history's most mind-boggling lifestyles. We are talking about aristocrats who danced to the beat of their own very peculiar drums. Imagine a queen who gave up her crown for books and art, a duke who dug miles of tunnels just to be alone, a super shy scientist who discovered a fundamental element but could barely order dinner, and a marquesa who treated cheetahs like house cats complete with diamond leashes. These are not fairy tales. These are the real lives of history's most eccentric single aristocrats, people whose wealth and independence allowed them to pursue their wildest whims, build fantastical follies, and live in ways that still make us gasp. Prepare to meet 10 individuals who prove that truth can be far stranger and more fascinating than fiction. Number 10. Robert Coates, the diamond-studded disaster on stage. Robert Coates, born in 1772 on the island of Antigua in the West Indies, was an aristocrat by virtue of a massive fortune inherited from his father, a wealthy sugar planter. He was not born with a title, but his immense wealth allowed him to live like a lord, and a very peculiar one at that. From a young age, Robert, who later earned the nickname Romeo Coates or Diamond Coates, showed a passion for amateur dramatics. Unfortunately, his passion far outstripped his talent. He was, by all accounts, a hilariously bad actor, but this did not deter him in the slightest. In fact, it became his main claim to fame. His London debut as an actor was eagerly anticipated, fueled by his reputation as an amateur of fashion. He first appeared as Romeo in William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet at the Haymarket Theatre in London on February 9, 1810. Performance was a sensation, though not for the reasons most actors would hope. Coates appeared in a spangled sky blue silk costume, complete with a feathered hat and diamond knee buckles. His performance was so inept, so over the top, and so full of unintentional comedy that the audience, initially stunned, soon erupted into laughter and mockery. He would often forget his lines ad-lib wildly, or repeat his favorite phrases with dramatic yet misplaced emphasis. During the famous balcony scene, he reportedly pulled out a diamond-encrusted snuff box and took a pinch of snuff with great ceremony. In the death scene, after expiring dramatically, he apparently got up, dusted himself off, and then lay down again when the audience protested he had not died properly. On another occasion, when playing Lothario in Nicholas Rowe's The Fair Penitent, he added extra death scenes simply because he enjoyed them so much, dying multiple times in one performance to the delight and derision of the crowd. Coates seemed blissfully unaware, or perhaps simply unconcerned, that the applause he received was often sarcastic, and the laughter was directed at him, not with him. He genuinely believed himself to be a great performer. He loved the attention. His costumes were a key part of his act. He possessed a vast collection of jewelry, particularly diamonds, which he wore extravagantly both on and off stage. His coats were adorned with diamond buttons, his fingers with diamond rings, and even his sword hilts glittered with precious stones. This ostentatious display earned him the moniker Diamond Coates. One of his most famous possessions was a custom-built phaeton carriage. It was shaped like a kettle drum or a scallop shell, richly gilded and emblazoned with his coat of arms, which featured a crowing cock and the motto, "While I live, I'll crow." This fantastical vehicle, drawn by 2 white horses, was a common sight in London's Hyde Park, further cementing his reputation as an eccentric. He would drive it himself, dressed in flamboyant furs and, of course, more diamonds. Despite his public persona and love for the limelight, Robert Coates never married. He had several romantic entanglements and was even sued for a breach of promise by a Miss Maria Ann Hughes in 1815, a case which brought him further public ridicule. He seemed to prefer the admiration, however mocking, of his audiences to any settled domestic life. His fortune, while substantial, was gradually depleted by his extravagant lifestyle and his theatrical pursuits, which were rarely profitable. He would often perform for charity, which perhaps endeared him to some, despite his lack of skill. His theatrical career spanned several years, with performances in various English cities, including Bath and Birmingham. The pattern was always the same: initial curiosity followed by a performance so uniquely terrible that it became a must-see event for those who enjoyed a good laugh. Critics were merciless, but audiences, for a time, kept coming. One critic described his Romeo as having a delivery like a parish clerk, a deportment like a toastmaster, and an execution like a telegraph. Another noted that his acting was so extravagantly bad as to acquire a kind of excellence. As he aged, his appearances became less frequent. The novelty of his bad acting eventually wore off for many. He continued to live in London, a recognizable figure with his outdated fashions and lingering air of theatricality. His final tragic performance was an unintentional one. On February 21, 1848, at the age of 75 or 76, Robert Coates was attending a performance at the Drury Lane Theatre. Afterwards, as he was crossing Russell Street, he was struck by a hansom cab. He sustained severe injuries and died a few days later at his lodgings. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Kensal Green Cemetery in London. Robert Romeo Coates remained a bachelor his entire life, a man whose great wealth allowed him to pursue his singular, if comically flawed, passion for the stage, leaving behind a legacy as one of history's most wonderfully terrible actors. Number 9. John Elwes, the miser, who starved in a mansion full of money. John Elwes, born John Megott in 1714 in Southwark, London, was an aristocrat of a very different and far more parsimonious kind. His mother was a renowned miser, and his uncle, Sir Harvey Elwes, was even more so. It seems the trait ran strong in the family. John inherited his first fortune from his father, a successful brewer, who died when John was only 4. His mother, despite having inherited nearly £100,000, supposedly starved herself to death because she was too cheap to spend money on food. John later changed his surname to Elwes as a condition of inheriting an even larger fortune, around £250,000, from his uncle, Sir Harvey Elwes, a baronet and member of Parliament known for his extreme frugality. Sir Harvey reportedly lived on partridges, he shot himself, and a single glass of wine a day, his grand house falling into ruin around him. John Elwes proved to be a more than worthy successor to his uncle's miserly habits. Despite his own considerable wealth, he was educated at Westminster School, where he was a competent classical scholar, and then sent on a grand tour of Europe. In Geneva, he was known for his skill as a horseman, and was introduced to the writer and philosopher Voltaire, with whom he reportedly gambled. These youthful indulgences, however, did not last. Once he came into his full inheritance, the spirit of extreme thrift took complete hold. Elwes became a member of Parliament for Berkshire from 1772 to 1784, a position he apparently sought to avoid paying election expenses, as his opponent withdrew. As a NEP, he was independent, voting according to his conscience, but he rarely spoke in Parliament. His attire was infamously shabby. He would wear clothes until they were threadbare, often patching them himself. He was known to wear a wig he found discarded in a gutter. He would sit in the House of Commons in wet clothes rather than pay for a coach or change, believing it saved him the expense of catching a cold if he dried off naturally. He would walk for miles in the rain to save on carriage fare. His houses, both in London and his country estate, Stoke Park in Suffolk, were testament to his penny pinching. They were sparsely furnished and often in a state of disrepair because he refused to spend money on upkeep. He would go to bed when daylight ended to save on candles. He ate very little, often picking decaying food from the street or eating game that was nearly rotten because it was free. One story tells of him eating a moorhen that a rat had pulled from a river. Another recounts him finding a partially eaten pancake on the road and consuming it. His servants lived on meager rations. Despite owning vast estates, he would sometimes join his own servants in gleaning leftover corn after the harvest. He was not without some redeeming qualities. He was reportedly honest in his dealings and could be surprisingly generous on rare occasions, particularly when it came to lending money to friends, though he was often swindled as a result. He lent considerable sums, sometimes without security, and lost thousands of pounds this way. Yet, his personal habits remained astoundingly frugal. He once owned a pack of hounds, but fed them so poorly they could barely run. He would gamble heavily at times, losing large sums at cards and London clubs, yet would begrudge spending a shilling on his own comfort. This paradox of being willing to risk thousands at the gaming table while haggling over pennies for necessities was a hallmark of his character. John Elwes never married. He did, however, have two illegitimate sons, George and John, with his housekeeper, Elizabeth Moran. He was fond of them and provided for them in his will, leaving them the bulk of his fortune, which was estimated to be around £500,000 at the time of his death, an enormous sum, equivalent to many tens of millions today. His reluctance to marry might have stemmed from his unwillingness to share his wealth, or his aversion to the expense of maintaining a wife and a society household. In his later years, his miserliness intensified, bordering on paranoia. He became increasingly reclusive. He would move between his various properties, often unannounced, sometimes sleeping on bare floorboards. He worried constantly about being robbed. There are stories of him hiding small sums of money in various nooks and crannies of his houses, then forgetting where he put them. He would sometimes be found wandering his dilapidated properties in a distressed state, searching for his hidden treasures. He suffered from delusions, sometimes believing he was impoverished. Despite his immense wealth, he lived in conditions of squalor that would have shamed the poorest laborer. John Elwes died on November 26, 1789, at the age of 75, at his house in Marcham, Berkshire. His life became a byword for extreme avarice. Charles Dickens is thought to have drawn inspiration from Elwes, among others, for the character of Ebenezer Scrooge. Elwes's story is a peculiar one of a man of noble birth and vast riches who chose to live in self-imposed poverty, a single-minded pursuit of saving that overshadowed all other aspects of his life, leaving behind a legacy as one of history's most renowned and eccentric misers. Number 8. Chevalier Dion the Spy, who was a woman, then a man, then a woman again. The Chevalier Dion, born Charles Genevieve Louis Auguste André Timothy Dion de Beaumont on October 5, 1728, in Tonnerre, France, was an aristocrat whose life was a tapestry of espionage, diplomacy, military service, and a gender identity that baffled and fascinated 18th century Europe. Dion came from a minor noble family and was exceptionally intelligent, graduating with a law degree by 1749. This intellect, combined with a certain daring, brought Dion to the attention of King Louis XIII. In 1756, Dion was recruited into the Secret du Roi, the king's personal network of spies. Dion's first major mission was to Russia, to the court of Empress Elizabeth. Some accounts, largely popularized by Dion later in life, suggest that Dion undertook this mission disguised as a woman, Leah de Beaumont, to gain access to the Empress. While the full truth of this early female disguise is debated by historians, It laid the groundwork for later events. Jeanne was successful in Russia, helping to establish diplomatic ties that would lead to an alliance between France and Russia during the 7 Years' War. Following the Russian missions, Jeanne served as a captain of dragoons in the French army during the later stages of the 7 Years' War, fighting with distinction and courage. Jeanne was wounded in action and commended for bravery. After the war in 1762, Jeanne was sent to London as part of the embassy negotiating the Treaty of Paris. Jeanne became interim ambassador, or minister plenipotentiary, in 1763 and was awarded the Order of St. Louis, becoming the Chevalier d'Eon. Jeanne was popular in London society, known for wit and intelligence. However, Jeanne's diplomatic career soon hit a snag. A new ambassador, the Comte de Guerchy, was appointed and Jeanne was demoted. Jeanne refused to accept this, accused Guerchy of attempting to poison him, and published secret diplomatic correspondence to embarrass the French government. This defiance led to Jeanne being declared an outlaw by France. Jeanne remained in London, living in exile for many years. It was during this period that rumors about Jeanne's biological sex, which had circulated quietly before, intensified. Betting pools were even set up on the London Stock Exchange regarding Jeanne's true sex. Jeanne possessed state secrets, including plans for a potential French invasion of Britain, which made the French government wary of taking forceful action. Jeanne lived as a man for the first 49 years of life. However, in 1774, after the death of Louis XV, Jeanne began negotiations to return to France. King Louis XV eventually agreed, but with a peculiar condition, possibly influenced by Jeanne's own assertions or the prevailing rumors. The French government officially declared Jeanne to be female and ordered Jeanne to wear women's clothing. Jeanne complied, and from 1777 onwards, lived as a woman. The reasons for this are complex and still debated. Jeanne claimed to have been born female, but raised as a boy to allow the family to inherit property. The government may have seen this as a way to neutralize Jeanne politically, as women had far fewer rights and public roles. Returning to France, dressed as a woman, the Chevalier, now officially Mademoiselle Jeanne, was granted a pension. However, Jeanne found the constraints of female attire and societal expectations frustrating, particularly the inability to participate in military affairs, such as the American Revolutionary War, for which Jeanne volunteered, but was refused. Jeanne returned to London in 1785. The French Revolution deprived Jeanne of the royal pension, leading to financial hardship. To earn money, Jeanne participated in fencing tournaments, dressed in women's clothes, shooting considerable skill with the sword. These public displays further fueled public fascination. The Chevalier Jeanne never married, regardless of the gender. Jeanne presented as. There were no recorded romantic relationships that led to marriage. Jeanne's life was dedicated to service, to France, to self-preservation, and in later years, to cultivating a unique public persona. Jeanne lived out the final years in London with a widowed friend, Mrs. Cole. The Chevalier Jeanne died in London on May 21, 1810, at the age of 81. Upon Jeanne's death, an autopsy was performed by a group of physicians in the presence of several witnesses. The examination conclusively proved that the Chevalier Jeanne was anatomically male. The findings were published, causing a sensation. For 33 years, Jeanne had lived publicly as a woman, under official sanction, yet possessed male biological characteristics. The Chevalier Jeanne's life remains a remarkable story of a complex individual who defied easy categorization. a spy, soldier, diplomat, and a figure who navigated the rigid gender expectations of the 18th century in a truly unique and eccentric fashion, leaving a legacy that continues to be discussed in terms of gender identity. Number 7. Gerald Tyrwhitt Wilson, Lord Berners, the man who dyed pigeons and had a giraffe for tea. Gerald Hugh Tyrwhitt Wilson, the 14th Baron Berners, born on September 18, 1883, was a British aristocrat who epitomized the English eccentric. He was a man of diverse talents, a composer of modernist music, a painter of considerable skill, a witty novelist, and a diplomat for a time. But it was his flamboyant personality and a penchant for the bizarre that truly set him apart. He inherited his title and Farringdon House in Oxfordshire in 1918, and it was here that many of his most famous eccentricities came to life. Lord Berners was known for his playful, almost surreal sense of humor. He had a sign at the entrance to Farringdon House that read, "Warning, children and dogs should not be left unattended, as the owner cannot be responsible for their safety." Another notice for visitors stated, "No dogs admitted except on a lead, and they must be dogs." He famously dyed his fantail pigeons in vibrant shades of pink, blue, green, and mauve, creating a startlingly colorful flock that would flutter around his estate. When a local woman complained that the dyed pigeons were unnatural, Berners reportedly replied, "But madam, they are naturally that color." His parties at Farringdon were legendary. He once invited Penelope Betjeman, wife of the poet John Betjeman, to tea, and when she arrived, she found a giraffe nibbling leaves in the garden, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Berners had apparently hired it from a circus. He was also known to drive around his estate in his Rolls-Royce with a small clavichord or spinet installed in the back, so he could compose music wherever inspiration struck. He sometimes wore a pig's head mask to amuse or startle his guests or unsuspecting locals. Berners was a talented composer, part of an avant-garde circle that included Igor Stravinsky and Constant Lambert. His music was often witty and parodic. He wrote ballets, operas, and piano pieces. His ballet, The Triumph of Neptune, with a scenario by Sacheverell Sitwell, was a success. He was also a gifted painter, exhibiting his works in London galleries, and an accomplished writer, publishing several whimsical and autobiographical novels, such as First Childhood and The Camel. Lord Berners never married. His long-term companion was Robert Heber Percy, who was considerably younger and known for his own wild behavior. Their relationship lasted for nearly 2 decades, and Heber Percy inherited Farringdon House upon Berners' death. In an era when homosexuality was illegal, their domestic arrangement was an open secret, tolerated within their sophisticated and artistic social circle, which included figures like Nancy Mitford, Evelyn Waugh, and Salvador Dali. Berners' single status, in the legal sense of not being married to a woman, allowed him a certain freedom to cultivate his unconventional lifestyle without the constraints of traditional aristocratic family expectations. His appearance was as distinctive as his behavior. He was often immaculately dressed, but with a subtle, mischievous twist. He had a wry sense of humor that permeated everything he did. He once built a 100-foot-high folly tower known as Farringdon Folly on a hill on his estate in 1935, purely for amusement and to enjoy the view. A notice at the foot of the tower, allegedly put there by Berners himself, read, "Members of the public committing suicide from this tower do so at their own risk." Despite his seemingly frivolous pursuits, Berners was a highly cultured and intelligent man. His eccentricities were not born of madness, but rather from a deliberate choice to live life on his own terms, finding amusement in the absurd and challenging the conventions of his class. He was a dandy, an aesthete, and a prankster all rolled into one. His home, Farringdon, became a haven for artists, writers, and musicians, a place where creativity and unconventionality were celebrated. Lord Berners died on April 19, 1950, at the age of 66 at Farringdon House. He requested that his epitaph be, "Here lies Lord Berners, one of the learners." His life was a testament to the idea that aristocracy did not have to mean stuffiness or conformity. He used his position and wealth to create a world of color, music, art, and laughter, leaving behind a legacy as one of Britain's most beloved and genuinely eccentric noblemen. His spirit of playful rebellion and artistic flair ensured he would be remembered not just for his title, but for the extraordinary and joyful way he lived his life. Number 6. Marchesa Luisa Casati, the living work of art with cheetahs on leashes. Luisa Adele Rosa Maria Aman, later known to the world as the Marchesa Luisa Casati Stampa di Soncino, was born on January 23, 1881, in Milan, Italy, into an immensely wealthy family. Her father, Alberto Aman, was a prosperous cotton manufacturer who was later made a count by King Umberto. The first Luisa and her older sister Francesca were orphaned at a young age, becoming, it was said, the wealthiest heiresses in Italy. This vast fortune provided Luisa with the means to live a life of unparalleled extravagance and eccentricity. In 1900, Luisa married Camillo Casati Stampa di Soncino, Marchese di Roma. They had one daughter, Cristina Tea. However, the conventional life of a noble wife did not suit Luisa. She and Camillo separated in 1914 and later divorced in 1924. It was after her separation that Luisa truly began to cultivate her astonishing public persona, becoming a legend in European high society and a muse to countless artists. She famously declared, "I want to be a living work of art." And a living work of art she became. The Marchesa Casati was renowned for her striking, almost terrifying beauty and her theatrical style. She was tall and slender, with enormous kohl-rimmed green eyes, flaming red hair, often dyed, and a deathly pale complexion. She accentuated her dramatic looks with outrageous costumes and jewels. She was known to wear live snakes as jewelry, their bodies coiling around her arms and neck. She favored fabrics like velvet, gold lame, and leopard skin, often commissioning outfits from the leading designers of the day, such as Paul Poiret and Mariano Fortuny. Her parties were the stuff of legend, held in the various opulent residences she acquired across Europe, including the Palazzo dei Leoni on the Grand Canal in Venice, later Peggy Guggenheim's home, the Villa San Michele in Capri, and a palace near Paris. These events were lavish, surreal, and often shocking. She would greet guests with her beloved pet cheetahs on diamond-studded leashes, or accompanied by servants gilded in gold, wax mannequins, some said to be likenesses of herself or her former lovers, would often be seated among the living guests at her dinner parties. She once hosted a ball where the theme was Cagliostro, the 18th century occultist, and she appeared as the magician himself. She was fascinated by the occult seances and all things mystical. The Marchesa's menagerie of pets was as exotic as her wardrobe. Apart from the cheetahs, she kept boa constrictors, monkeys, parrots, and a flock of white peacocks that she sometimes had dyed different colors to match her themed events. She was often seen strolling through the streets of Venice or Paris late at night, naked beneath her furs, walking her cheetahs. Her aim was to startle, to provoke, and to inspire. And inspire she did. She was a muse and patron to a staggering number of artists, writers, and designers. Futurists like Filippo Tommaso Marinetti and Fortunato di Pero, painters like Giovanni Boldini, Augustus John Keys van Dongen, and Romaine Brooks, photographers like Man Ray and Cecil Beaton, All fell under her spell and immortalized her in their work. There are estimated to be over 130 portraits of her. Her life was a constant performance. She sought out experiences that were new, thrilling, and often dangerous. She was not merely content to be looked at, she actively created her own myth. She collected not just art, but experiences and people. Her lovers were numerous and often as famous and unconventional as she was, including the writer Gabriele D'Annunzio, who called her Corée after the queen of the underworld and whose influence shaped much of her decadent persona. However, this relentless pursuit of the extraordinary came at an enormous financial cost. The Marchesa Casati spent her colossal fortune with breathtaking speed. She bought properties she rarely lived in, commissioned artworks she sometimes never paid for, and threw parties that cost fortunes. By the 1930s, her debts had reached an astronomical figure, reportedly around 25 million United States dollars. Her possessions were seized and auctioned off. Even Chanel, one of her creditors, was present at the auction of her Paris house. Despite her financial ruin, Luisa Casati never lost her distinctive style or her indomitable spirit. She moved to London with her daughter Christina and lived in much reduced circumstances, but still managed to maintain an air of faded grandeur. She was known to rummage through bins for scraps of fabric to adorn her clothes, and was seen at openings wearing her old, magnificent but tattered finery. She continued to practice her occult rituals and was often seen by neighbors feeding birds in local parks, a striking figure even in her poverty. The Marchesa Luisa Casati died of a stroke on June 1, 1957, in London at the age of 76. She was buried in Brompton Cemetery, dressed in one of her leopard print ensembles, and accompanied by one of her stuffed Pekingese dogs. Her epitaph, chosen by her granddaughter, quotes Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra: "Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety." Her life, lived entirely on her own terms after her separation and divorce, was a spectacular and ultimately unsustainable performance, making her one of the 20th century's most unforgettable eccentrics and a testament to the power of self-creation. Number 5. William Beckford. The man who built a cathedral to himself and lost it all. William Thomas Beckford, born on October 1, 1760, in London, was an English novelist, art collector, critic, travel writer, and politician. But he is perhaps best remembered for his immense inherited wealth, his scandalous private life, and his magnificent ill-fated architectural folly. Fonthill Abbey. At the age of just 10, Beckford inherited a colossal fortune from his father, William Beckford Sr., who had been Lord Mayor of London and owned vast sugar plantations in Jamaica worked by enslaved people. The inheritance included around £1 million in cash estates in England and Jamaica, and an annual income of approximately £100,000, making him one of the wealthiest individuals in England. Beckford was a precocious and gifted child. He received an intensive private education, learning music from Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who visited London when Beckford was a boy, and architectural drawing from Sir William Chambers. He was fluent in several languages and possessed a fertile imagination which found expression in his most famous literary work, the Gothic novel Vathek, written in French in 1782. In a single, intense burst of creativity lasting, he claimed 3 days and 2 nights. His life took a dramatic turn in 1784, when he became embroiled in a notorious scandal involving William Kitty Courtenay, the young son of Viscount Courtenay, later the 9th Earl of Devon. Allegations of a homosexual relationship between Beckford and the then 16-year-old Courtenay surfaced, leading to social ostracism. Homosexuality was illegal and severely punished at the time. Although no charges were formally brought, Beckford's reputation was ruined. He had married Lady Margaret Gordon in 1783, who stood by him, but the scandal forced them into a form of exile, living mostly in Switzerland and Portugal. Lady Margaret died in childbirth in 1786, after only 3 years of marriage, leaving Beckford with 2 young daughters. He never remarried, remaining a widower for the next 58 years of his life, a period during which his eccentricities truly flourished, fueled by his wealth, isolation, and artistic temperament. Barred from the highest echelons of British society and from receiving the peerage he craved, Beckford retreated into a world of his own making. He returned to England and, starting in 1796, began the most ambitious and famous project of his life, the construction of Fonthill Abbey in Wiltshire. This was not an actual abbey, but a gigantic Gothic revival fantasy house designed by James Wyatt. It was intended to be a private cathedral to art and solitude. Its most prominent feature was a massive, octagonal tower, originally planned to be 300 feet high. Beckford drove the construction with manic energy, employing hundreds of workers, sometimes working day and night by torchlight. He wanted the abbey built quickly, regardless of cost or structural soundness. Fonthill Abbey became a symbol of Beckford's romantic sensibilities, his immense wealth, and his defiance of convention. The interiors were lavishly decorated and filled with his extraordinary collection of art, books, and precious objects. He lived there in splendid isolation, rarely admitting visitors. The few who were granted access described a place of almost magical, if somewhat gloomy, magnificence. However, the haste and shoddy workmanship of its construction, particularly of the central tower, led to inevitable problems. Tower collapsed in 1800 during construction, was rebuilt, and then collapsed again spectacularly in 1825, by which time Beckford had already sold the estate. Beckford's spending on Fonthill, coupled with mismanagement of his West Indian plantations, especially after the abolition of the slave trade, impacted their profitability, and some unfortunate investments gradually eroded his fortune. In 1822, he was forced to sell Fonthill Abbey and its contents for £330,000 to a gunpowder magnate, John Farquhar. Beckford moved to Bath, where he bought 2 houses in Lansdowne Crescent and connected them with a 1-story archway. Here he began a new project, though on a smaller scale, Lansdowne Tower, also known as Beckford's Tower. This neoclassical tower, over 150 feet high, was built on Lansdowne Hill, overlooking Bath. He filled it with treasures from his collection and spent much of his later life there, still collecting, writing, and living in relative seclusion. William Beckford died on May 2, 1844, in Bath, at the age of 83. He was buried, as per his wishes, in a sarcophagus on land near Lansdowne Tower, which later became Lansdowne Cemetery. His life was one of extraordinary privilege, artistic passion, scandal, and ultimately a degree of melancholy. His single status for nearly 6 decades, combined with his social isolation and immense resources, allowed him to indulge his architectural and collecting manias to an extent few could imagine. While Fonthill Abbey is now mostly ruins, and much of his art collection dispersed, Beckford's Tower still stands a monument to a man who lived life as a grand, if often troubled, romantic spectacle. Number 4. Christina, Queen of Sweden, the monarch, who gave up a kingdom for freedom. Christina, born Christina Augusta on December 18, 1626 in Stockholm, was the Queen of Sweden from 1632 until her abdication in 1654. She was an aristocrat of the highest order, a reigning monarch in her own right. Her father, the great warrior King Gustavus Adolphus, died in battle when she was just 6 years old, leaving her as his heir. Recognizing her intelligence, Gustavus Adolphus had ordered that Christina be educated as a prince, not a princess. As a result, she received a rigorous classical education, studying languages, philosophy, theology, mathematics, and astronomy. She was a brilliant student, fluent in at least 7 languages. Christina officially came of age and began her personal rule in 1644. Her court in Stockholm became one of the most learned in Europe. She invited scholars, musicians, and artists from across the continent, including the renowned French philosopher René Descartes, who tragically died of pneumonia in the harsh Swedish winter while tutoring her in 1650. Christina was a passionate collector of books, manuscripts, paintings, and sculptures, amassing a significant library and art collection. She was known for her sharp intellect, her wit, and her often unconventional behavior. She preferred comfortable, often masculine attire to elaborate court gowns, and she had a deep, commanding voice. She was an excellent horsewoman and enjoyed hunting. One of the most significant aspects of Christina's reign and personal life was her resolute refusal to marry. Marriage for a queen usually meant ceding power to a husband or being used as a political pawn to secure alliances. Christina fiercely guarded her independence and her authority. She famously declared, "I would rather die than be married." She did nominate her cousin Charles Gustave as her heir to ensure a smooth succession, but she resisted all pressure to take a husband. This decision to remain single was highly unusual for a monarch of her time and was a clear indication of her independent spirit. Her reign was marked by efforts to bring peace. She was instrumental in concluding the 30 Years' War with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. However, her extravagant spending on art and her court, coupled with her growing disillusionment with the burdens of rule and her increasing interest in Catholicism, Sweden was a staunchly Lutheran country, led her to a momentous decision. On June 6, 1654, at the age of 27, Christina abdicated the Swedish throne in favor of her cousin Charles X Gustav. It was a stunning act. She gave up her kingdom, she said, for freedom to travel, to study, and to pursue her intellectual and spiritual interests without the constraints of queenship. After her abdication, Christina left Sweden famously disguised as a man for part of her journey to avoid recognition. She traveled through Europe and in Brussels in December 1654, secretly converted to Catholicism. Public conversion took place in Innsbruck, Austria, in November 1655. This was a hugely controversial act, as her father had been the great champion of Protestantism during the 30 Years' War. Her conversion made her a celebrated figure in Catholic Europe, but a pariah in Protestant Sweden. Christina eventually settled in Rome in 1655, where she was welcomed by the Pope and the Roman aristocracy. She established a vibrant, intellectual, and artistic salon in her residence, the Palazzo Farnese, and later, the Palazzo Riario, now Palazzo Corsini. She became a major patron of music, art, and theater, supporting composers like Arcangelo Corelli and Alessandro Scarlatti, and artists like Gian Lorenzo Bernini. She founded academies, continued to build her collections, and engaged in lively correspondence with the leading thinkers of the day. Her life in Rome was not without drama. She was politically active, sometimes meddling in papal politics and international affairs, which occasionally led to friction with the papal authorities. In 1657, while in France, attempting to engineer a claim to the Neapolitan throne, she ordered the execution of her master of horse, the Marchese Gian Rinaldo Monaldeschi, for suspected treason. This summary execution, carried out in the Palace of Fontainebleau, shocked Europe and tarnished her reputation, highlighting a ruthless streak. Despite such episodes, Christina remained a formidable and fascinating figure. She never married, living her life as an independent woman, beholden to no man. Her relationships were intense, often with other women or with male intellectuals and churchmen, but none led to marriage. She dressed as she pleased, spoke her mind freely, and defied societal expectations for women, let alone ex-queens. She was a complex mix of intellectual brilliance, artistic passion, political ambition, and deep religious conviction. Christina died in Rome on April 19, 1689, at the age of 62. She was given a grand funeral, and in a rare honor for a woman not of papal lineage, was buried in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. Her tomb is one of the few for women in the basilica. Christina of Sweden remains one of history's most intriguing monarchs, an eccentric in the sense that she deliberately chose a path radically different from what was expected of her, sacrificing a crown for intellectual and personal liberty and living a life of passionate engagement with the world of ideas, art, and power, all while fiercely meaning her engagement. Number 3. Henry Cavendish, the reclusive genius who weighed the world. Henry Cavendish, born on October 10, 1731, in Nice, France, was an English aristocrat, natural philosopher, scientist, and one of the most brilliant and eccentric figures in the history of science. He was the son of Lord Charles Cavendish, son of the 2nd Duke of Devonshire, and Lady Anne Grey, daughter of the 1st Duke of Kent, placing him firmly within the British aristocracy. Despite his noble lineage and immense inherited wealth, Henry Cavendish lived a life of extreme reclusion and singular devotion to scientific inquiry. He never married and seemed to avoid human interaction as much as possible, particularly with women. Cavendish attended Dr. Newcomb's Academy in Hackney and then Peterhouse, Cambridge, from 1749 to 1753, but he left without taking a degree, a not uncommon practice for aristocrats at the time. He inherited a vast fortune from various relatives, including an aunt, which made him one of the richest men in England. However, money held little interest for him beyond its ability to fund his scientific pursuits and his extensive library. He was notoriously frugal in his personal habits, though generous in supporting scientific endeavors. His defining characteristic was his pathological shyness and taciturnity. He was described as having a nervous, high-pitched voice, and he often struggled to speak directly to people, especially strangers. If approached unexpectedly, he might let out a small cry and flee. He found interactions with women so distressing that he went to extraordinary lengths to avoid them. It is famously recounted that he communicated with his female servants primarily through notes. He once encountered a maidservant on a staircase and was so agitated by the unexpected meeting that he immediately ordered a separate back staircase to be built in his London house on Clapham Common to prevent any recurrence. Any female servant who crossed his path risked instant dismissal. His London house was essentially a laboratory and library, not a comfortable home. The grand rooms were filled with scientific instruments. The drawing room was converted into an experimental workshop, and the stables were fitted out as a laboratory. He had another house at a different location specifically for his extensive library, which he allowed other scholars to use, provided they followed strict rules and did not attempt to engage him in conversation. He would reportedly order books by leaving a note for his librarian. His daily routine was unvarying. He took a solitary walk every day, always following the same route. His meals were simple and monotonous, almost invariably a leg of mutton. A famous anecdote illustrates his indifference to food and company. When his housekeeper asked what he wanted for dinner, he would reply, "A leg of mutton." If she inquired if he was expecting guests and needed more, he might say, "Then 2 legs of mutton." His wardrobe was equally unchanging. He wore suits of a faded violet or drab color, the style of which was decades out of fashion, typically with a 3-cornered hat. When one suit wore out, he simply ordered an exact replica. Despite, or perhaps because of his extreme reclusiveness, Henry Cavendish was a scientist of extraordinary caliber. He made groundbreaking discoveries in chemistry and physics. He is most famous for his 1766 paper on factitious airs, in which he described the discovery of inflammable air, which we now know as hydrogen. He accurately determined its density and showed that it produced water when burned. This was a pivotal step in understanding the composition of water. He also investigated the composition of atmospheric air with remarkable precision, identifying that about 1/5 was dephlogisticated air, oxygen, and the rest phlogisticated air, nitrogen. He even noted a small, unreactive gaseous residue about 1/120th of the air, which was later identified as argon by Lord Rayleigh and William Ramsay almost a century later. Perhaps his most celebrated experiment, conducted in 1797–1798, was the determination of the density of the Earth, often referred to as weighing the world. Using a sophisticated torsion balance apparatus designed by John Mitchell, Cavendish made incredibly precise measurements of the gravitational attraction between lead spheres. From these results, he calculated the Earth's density to be 5.448 times that of water, a figure remarkably close to the currently accepted value of 5.515. Many of Cavendish's other important discoveries in electricity and heat remained unpublished during his lifetime, found only in his manuscripts long after his death. These notes revealed that he had anticipated many later findings, including Ohm's law, Coulomb's law, and principles of electrical conductivity. Had he published these, his fame would have been even greater. His reluctance to publish stemmed from his aversion to public attention and his focus on research for its own sake, not for recognition. He rarely attended meetings of the Royal Society, despite being a fellow. Henry Cavendish died on February 24, 1810, in London, at the age of 78, as solitarily as he had lived. He left behind a fortune of over £1 million. He never married and had no known romantic attachments. His entire existence was dedicated to the pursuit of scientific knowledge, conducted in an environment of self-imposed isolation that allowed him to concentrate fully on his experiments. His life demonstrates that immense eccentricity can coexist with profound genius, and his contributions to science remain fundamental, a legacy of a man who spoke little to the world but revealed much about its workings. Number 2. William Cavendish Scott Bentinck, 5th Duke of Portland, the reclusive aristocrat who lived underground. William John Cavendish Scott Bentinck, the 5th Duke of Portland, born on September 17, 1800, was one of 19th century Britain's wealthiest and most profoundly eccentric aristocrats. He inherited the Dukedom of Portland and the vast Welbeck Abbey estate in Nottinghamshire in 1854. What followed was one of the most bizarre and extensive building projects ever undertaken by a private individual, all seemingly designed to facilitate the Duke's extreme desire for privacy and isolation. He never married and went to extraordinary lengths to avoid human contact. The Duke was notoriously reclusive. He did not want to be seen or spoken to. His staff at Welbeck Abbey were under strict instructions not to acknowledge him if they encountered him on the estate. If he was walking and saw someone approaching, he would reportedly hide behind a tree or turn and flee. He wore several layers of old-fashioned coats, regardless of the weather, often with a very tall hat and an extremely high collar, and carried a large ancient umbrella. Communicated with his household staff primarily through written notes passed by a double-doored letterbox installed in his private suite of rooms. This suite consisted of 5 rooms, all painted pink, with commodes in every corner. He only ate chicken, which was roasted in his kitchens, then sent up to his rooms on a heated miniature railway that ran through the service tunnels. His most famous eccentricity was the creation of an astonishing network of underground structures beneath Welbeck Abbey. These were not mere cellars, but vast subterranean halls and miles of tunnels. Among these remarkable constructions were a huge underground ballroom 174 feet long and 64 feet wide, intended, some said, for roller skating parties, though it was never used for any social gathering. It featured a hydraulic lift capable of carrying 20 guests from the surface, though no guests ever came. The room was painted pink and had a magnificent ceiling, an enormous library 236 feet long, also largely unused for its intended purpose, though it housed thousands of books. Complex of kitchens, larders, and sculleries, all underground, complete with the aforementioned miniature railway to transport food. Miles of tunnels, some wide enough for a horse and carriage, connecting various parts of the estate. One tunnel, over 1.5 miles long, ran from the abbey to the local railway station at Worksop. This tunnel was wide enough for 2 carriages to pass, and was lit by gas lamps during the day, even though the Duke rarely used it in daylight, preferring to travel at night in a closed carriage with the blinds drawn. The tunnel was meant to allow him to travel to London without being seen. The Duke employed thousands of workmen on these projects over several decades, providing much-needed employment in the area. The scale of the work was immense, and the cost ran into millions of pounds. Yet most of these magnificent underground spaces remained empty and unused, monuments to their creator's reclusive nature. The Duke himself rarely ventured into them. He preferred his small suite of 5 rooms. His reasons for these extraordinary constructions remain a subject of speculation. Some believed he was disfigured or suffering from a skin disease that made him shun society, though there is little concrete evidence for this. Others thought he was simply an extreme introvert, whose shyness bordered on a phobia of social interaction. He had a great interest in architecture and engineering, and the building projects may have been an expression of this, albeit a very unusual one. He was also known to be litigious and engaged in many legal disputes. Despite his aversion to personal contact, the Duke was not entirely cut off from the world. He maintained an extensive correspondence, conducted through his solicitors or his letterbox. He was involved in political matters, though he never spoke in the House of Lords. He was also known for acts of quiet charity. He never married and had no children. His private life was so intensely guarded that all sorts of rumors circulated about him, including whispers that he kept a harem in the tunnels or that he was leading a double life. One persistent rumor, which led to a famous court case after his death, the Druce Portland case, claimed that the Duke was also a London upholsterer named Thomas Charles Druce who had faked his own death. This was eventually proven false. The 5th Duke of Portland died on December 6, 1879, at his London residence Harcourt House. He was 79 years old. His body was taken by train to Welbeck and interred in Kensal Green Cemetery in London. He left behind an estate that was both magnificent and bewildering. Welbeck Abbey, with its vast, silent underground world, stood as a testament to one man's extraordinary wealth and his equally extraordinary desire to be alone. His life was a profound enigma, a study in extreme eccentricity, where an aristocrat used his immense resources not for ostentatious display to society, but to create an elaborate private kingdom designed to keep society out. He remains one of history's most reclusive and mysterious figures. Number 1. Ludwig I of Bavaria, the Swan King, who built fairy tale, castles, and lived a dream. Ludwig I, King of Bavaria, born on August 25, 1845, at Nymphenburg Palace, near Munich, is perhaps one of history's most iconic eccentric aristocrats. Known as the Swan King, the Fairy Tale King, Märchenkönig, or sometimes Mad King Ludwig, he ascended to the Bavarian throne in 1864 at the young age of 18. His reign was characterized by a passionate devotion to art, music, and architecture, and a profound distaste for the mundane duties of statecraft leading to an increasingly reclusive and fantastical existence. Ludwig was a handsome and idealistic young king, initially popular with his subjects. However, he had a deeply romantic and imaginative nature, finding solace in poetry, mythology, and the operas of Richard Wagner. Wagner became a central figure in Ludwig's life. The king was an ardent admirer and became Wagner's devoted patron, rescuing the composer from financial ruin and providing him with the means to create some of his greatest works, including Tristan und Isolde, Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg, and parts of the Ring Cycle. Ludwig's financial support for Wagner was substantial, amounting to several 100,000 florins over the years. While Ludwig's patronage of Wagner was a significant cultural contribution, his true obsession lay in creating his own fantasy worlds through architecture. He embarked on a series of extravagant castle-building projects funded largely from his personal fortune and extensive borrowing, which eventually strained the royal finances. These castles were not intended for state representation or military defense, but were deeply personal expressions of his romantic ideals and artistic visions, often inspired by Wagnerian operas and medieval legends. The most famous of these is Neuschwanstein Castle, a breathtaking Romanesque revival palace perched dramatically on a rugged hill near Füssen in southwest Bavaria. Construction began in 1869 and was still unfinished at the time of Ludwig's death. Its fairy-tale towers and turrets have become a global symbol of romantic architecture and inspired Disney's Sleeping Beauty castle. The interiors are a riot of color and craftsmanship depicting scenes from Wagner's operas, particularly Tannhäuser and Lohengrin, Lohengrin being the Swan Knight with whom Ludwig strongly identified. Linderhof Palace, built between 1874 and 1878, is a much smaller but equally opulent Rococo gem, inspired by the Palace of Versailles. It features a hall of mirrors and stunning formal gardens, including a man-made grotto with an illuminated lake, where Ludwig would sometimes be rowed in a golden shell-shaped boat while listening to music. Herentium Sea Palace, begun in 1878 on an island in the Chiemsee Lake, was Ludwig's attempt to create a Bavarian Versailles. Its hall of mirrors is even larger than the original at Versailles. Though never completed, the sections that were built are staggeringly lavish. Ludwig only stayed there for a few days. These building projects consumed Ludwig's attention and resources. He became increasingly withdrawn from public life and the affairs of government, preferring to immerse himself in his architectural dreams and nocturnal sleigh rides through the Bavarian countryside in ornate gilded sleighs, sometimes dressed in historical costume. He was a night owl, often sleeping during the day and working or traveling at night. He developed peculiar dining habits, sometimes insisting on dining alone even when he had invited imaginary guests from history such as Louis Ziv of France. Ludwig never married. He was briefly engaged in 1867 to Duchess Sophie Charlotte in Bavaria, his cousin and the sister of Empress Elizabeth Sisi of Austria. However, Ludwig repeatedly postponed the wedding and eventually broke off the engagement. His personal diaries and private letters, discovered after his death, reveal his struggles with his homosexual desires, which were considered sinful and scandalous at the time, and likely contributed to his avoidance of marriage and his increasing isolation. As Ludwig's debts mounted and his behavior became more erratic, the Bavarian government grew concerned. His ministers found it increasingly difficult to govern with a king who was largely inaccessible and uninterested in state matters. In 1886, a government commission, relying on the testimony of servants and without a personal medical examination of the king, declared Ludwig insane and unfit to rule. The diagnosis was paranoia. On June 10, 1886, Ludwig was officially deposed and his uncle, Prince Luitpold, became Prince Regent. Ludwig was taken from Neuschwanstein and interned at Berg Castle on the shores of Lake Starnberg. Just 3 days later, on the evening of June 13, 1886, Ludwig D. and Dr. Bernhard von Gudden The psychiatrist who had diagnosed him went for a walk along the lakeshore. They never returned. Their bodies were found later that night in the shallow waters of the lake. Ludwig was 40 years old. The circumstances of their deaths remain a mystery. The official finding was that Ludwig murdered Dr. Gudden and then drowned himself. However, many alternative theories persist, including assassination or an escape attempt gone wrong, fueled by inconsistencies in the official account and the enduring affection many Bavarians felt for their beloved unhappy king. Ludwig's reign was short and unconventional. He left Bavaria with significant debts, but also with a legacy of architectural marvels that continue to draw millions of visitors each year, becoming major tourist attractions and a vital part of Bavaria's cultural identity. His life was a poignant blend of artistic genius, romantic idealism, profound loneliness, and ultimately, tragedy. He remains a captivating figure, the ultimate eccentric aristocrat who dared to live out his fantasies on a royal scale, a king who preferred dreams to reality.